Hey friends, how is it that a man who spent his life shadowed by a darkness so profound he often doubted his own desire to remain on this earth could also be the most prolific storyteller and jokesmith of his age? We often think of great leaders as pillars of unshakable stone, yet the man we are visiting tonight was more like a willow bending deeply, feeling every gust of the storm, yet somehow refusing to snap. How does a soul hollowed out by personal grief find the inner volume to hold the grief of an entire nation? I want you to imagine, for a moment, the smell of an old room. It is a scent of beeswax, wood smoke, and the faint metallic tongue of ink drying on parchment. There is the sound of a heavy wool coat being draped over a chair, the fabric thick and slightly coarse to the touch. In the corner, a tallow candle flickers, its light struggling against the vast, encroaching shadows of a high-ceilinged office. Outside the window, the world is changing. Steam engines are beginning to hiss across the plains, and the old ways of the frontier are slowly being etched over by the progress of a new century. This is the world of Abraham Lincoln, a world where the floorboards creak under the weight of a man who stood 6 feet, 4 inches tall, a height that made him a literal giant in a time when the average man reached only to his shoulder. This life forged in the dirt of a backwoods cabin and polished in the fires of civil war still echoes in the way we talk about freedom and the way we understand the quiet dignity of a person who simply refuses to give up. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy drifting off to these stories of great minds. I'd also love to hear where you re-listening from tonight. Feel free to leave a comment with your city and your local time. It's always so peaceful to know we're all resting under the same stars. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Take a deep breath in through your nose, feeling the cool air fill your chest, and then let it out slowly, imagining the tension of the day dissolving like salt in a warm stream. Your bed is a safe harbor. The blankets are heavy and warm, and for the next hour or so, there is nothing you need to solve, nowhere you need to go. We are stepping back in time, walking softly across the threshold of history to meet a man whose face is perhaps the most recognized in the world, yet whose heart remained a mystery even to those who sat at his dinner table. Abraham Lincoln was a man of immense physical presence. As the tallest president in American history, his silhouette was unmistakable: long, spindly limbs, large hands that had swung heavy axes since childhood, and a face that seemed to have been carved out of the very granite of the hills. But even more fascinating than his height was the way he carried his thoughts. You might see him walking down a street in Springfield or a corridor in the White House, and he would often seem to be miles away, lost in a reverie, as his friends called it. There is a charming, humanizing quirk that his clerks often noted. Lincoln used his famous stovepipe hat as a mobile filing cabinet. He would tuck important letters, legal briefs, and even his own handwritten notes into the silk lining of the crown. When he walked, his thoughts and his work literally sat atop his head, a heavy crown of papers that he would occasionally remove to search through, his fingers long and deliberate as he found the exact page he needed. It is a small detail, but it speaks to a man who is practical, a bit disorganized in a brilliant way, and entirely unconcerned with the rigid formalities of high society. However, beneath the jokes and the hatful of papers, there was a deep, tidal pull of sadness. Modern historians and psychologists often look back at his writings and the accounts of his friends, wondering about the true nature of what was then called hypochondriasis or melancholy. Some biographers still wonder whether Lincoln's depression was a biological inheritance, a chemical weight he was born to carry, or if it was the natural result of a life that saw more than its fair share of death and disappointment. Was his sadness a weakness he overcame, or was it actually the source of his empathy, the very thing that allowed him to feel the suffering of others so acutely? As you lie there, imagine the quiet of a prairie night. The wind whispers through the tall grass, a sound like a long drawn-out hush. This was the music of Lincoln's youth. He was a man of the earth, born in a single-room log cabin in Kentucky, where the floor was packed dirt and the bed was a bag of corn husks. There was no wealth here, no grand library, no pedigree. There was only the hard, rhythmic labor of survival. Yet, even in that harsh environment, a mind was beginning to wake up. You could almost see a young boy huddled near a fireplace, the only source of light in the cabin after the sun went down. He is reading by the orange glow of the embers, his eyes moving over the words of Aesop's fables or the Bible. The world outside is wild wolves howl in the distance, and the forest is a dense, dark wall, but inside his mind there are stories of justice, of cleverness, and of the slow, steady march of truth. Lincoln was a man of contradictions. He was a frontier woodsman who loved the precision of Euclid's geometry. He was a politician who detested the low games of the trade, yet mastered them to save a country. He was a man who felt the weight of every casualty of war, yet could spend hours telling a ribald story to make a room full of strangers roar with laughter. This laughter was not a sign of lightness. It was his medicine. He once said, "If I did not laugh, I should die." As we begin this journey through his life, feel yourself sinking deeper into your pillow. The air in your room is still and calm. We are leaving the noise of the modern world behind and moving toward the soft, rhythmic sounds of the 19th century. The clip-clop of horse hooves on a dirt road, the rustle of a newspaper, the slow, steady ticking of a grandfather clock in a silent hallway. We are going back to the very beginning, to a cold February morning in 1809, to a place called Sinking Spring Farm. There is a sense of stillness there, a quiet anticipation in the air. The story of the man who would save the Union doesn't start with a fanfare of trumpets, but with the small, fragile cry of a newborn in a cabin that smelled of cedar and damp earth. As you listen, let the details of his life wash over you like a gentle tide. There is no need to memorize, no need to analyze. Just let the image of the tall man with the sad eyes and the hat full of dreams lead you toward a place of rest. His journey was long and difficult, marked by steep climbs and dark valleys, but it was a journey taken with a steady heart and a profound sense of purpose. And as he found his way through the wilderness, perhaps we can find our own way toward a peaceful, restorative sleep. The candle in our story is burning low now, the flame steady and warm. The shadows on the wall are soft and blurry. We are moving away from the presidency and the wars, back toward the Kentucky woods, where the air is fresh, and the only task is to listen to the story of a boy who would grow up to change the world one word and one honest step at a time. To understand the man, we must first understand the ground he walked upon. Imagine the Kentucky of 1809, not the manicured, rolling bluegrass hills of a modern postcard, but a wild, untamed labyrinth of ancient hardwoods and limestone shadows. This was the edge of the world as far as the young American Republic was concerned. It was a place where the map was still being drawn in ink that was barely dry, and the silence of the wilderness was so profound that you could hear the snap of a dry twig from 100 yards away. The air was thick with the scent of damp moss, decomposing leaves, and the sharp, clean bite of cedar. In this era, time didn't move by the ticking of a clock, but by the slow rotation of the seasons and the rising and falling of the sun. Life was measured in the distance between water sources and the amount of wood stacked against the side of a cabin. You can almost feel the chill of a February morning on the Kentucky frontier, a damp, bone-deep cold that lingers in the hollows and clings to the rough-hewn logs of the settlers' homes. This was the landscape that greeted Abraham Lincoln on the 12th day of February, the very same day that, across the Atlantic in England, a boy named Charles Darwin was also entering the world. Two lives began simultaneously that would eventually reshape how humanity understood itself, one through the lens of natural science, and the other through the lens of human liberty. The home where Abraham first opened his eyes was a single-room log cabin at Sinking Spring Farm. It was roughly 16 by 18 feet, a tiny box of civilization carved out of a vast forest. The floor was not made of planks, but of packed earth, smoothed down by the passage of heavy leather boots. There was a single window, but in those days, glass was a luxury beyond the reach of a frontier family. Instead, the opening was covered with greased paper or animal skin, which allowed a pale, ghostly light to filter into the room, barely illuminating the corners where the shadows liked to hide. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a man of the earth and the wood. Often portrayed in older histories as a shiftless or lazy man, modern scholars have begun to paint a more nuanced portrait of a skilled carpenter and a determined pioneer. You can imagine Thomas at his workbench, his large, calloused hands guiding a draw knife over a piece of cherry wood. He was known for making fine furniture-sturdy corner cupboards and chests that still exist in museums today, held together with precise mortise and tenon joints. There is a humanizing dignity in the idea of Lincoln's father as a craftsman, a man who understood the grain of the wood and the importance of a level foundation. Yet, Thomas was also a victim of the era's chaotic land laws. In Kentucky at that time, titles were often overlapping and poorly recorded. Thomas would clear a field, build a home, and pay his taxes, only to have a stranger appear with a different piece of paper claiming the land belonged to someone else. Some biographers still wonder whether this constant, frustrating insecurity, the feeling of the ground being pulled out from under him, was what fueled his son's later obsession with the absolute clarity of the law. The heart of the home, however, was Nancy Hanks Lincoln, Abraham's mother. History describes her as a deeply religious woman with a highly intellectual cast of mind, despite her lack of formal education. She was the one who whispered stories in the dark and sang the old hymns that stayed with Lincoln until his dying day. In the quiet of the evening, as the fire burned low in the stone hearth, she would have been the steady presence in the room, her voice a soft counterpoint to the howling wind outside. The bond between the boy and his mother was forged in these quiet, isolated moments, a connection so deep that years later, Lincoln would famously say, "All that I am or hope to be I owe to my angel mother." Life on the frontier was a series of rhythmic, repetitive tasks. You can almost hear the rhythmic thwack of an axe echoing through the trees, a sound that would become the soundtrack of Lincoln's youth. There was the churning of butter, the spinning of wool, and the constant, essential gathering of water. The farm was named for the sinking spring, a natural limestone feature where water bubbled up from the earth and then disappeared back into a dark, subterranean cave. This spring was the lifeblood of the family. Imagine a young Abraham, perhaps only 4 or 5 years old, carrying a small wooden bucket down the slope to the spring, watching the clear, cold water swirl over the mossy rocks. The water was constant, hidden, and deep, much like the inner life of the boy who was growing up beside it. In this world, people were few and far between. A neighbor was someone who lived 3 miles away through a dense thicket of briars. This isolation bred a particular kind of character, self-reliant, observant, and deeply attuned to the stories people told when they finally did get together. When a traveler passed through, or when the family gathered at a brush arbor meeting for a visiting preacher, every word was precious. Language was the only entertainment, the only bridge to the world beyond the trees. This is where Lincoln's legendary love for storytelling began. He lived in an era where a well-told story wasn't just a diversion. It was a currency. There is a quirky detail about the Lincoln family's place in this world that often surprises people. While we think of them as being on the very bottom rung of the social ladder, Thomas Lincoln was actually a respected member of his community for a time. He served on juries and acted as a road surveyor, helping to mark out the paths that would eventually become the arteries of the state. He was a man who participated in the basic building blocks of democracy before his son ever knew what the word meant. Yet, the family lived in a world where literacy was fluid and inconsistent. In early records, the family name is often spelled phonetically as Lincoln or Lincoln. It was a world of sounds rather than fixed symbols, where the spoken word carried more weight than the written one. As you lie there, try to picture the vastness of that 1809 sky. Without the glow of city lights, the stars would have been incredibly bright, looking like spilled salt on a velvet cloth. The nights were truly dark, and the silence was heavy. In such a world, a child's imagination is forced to grow inward. Without toys or books or neighbors, the mind becomes its own playground. You can see the tall, spindly boy sitting on the doorstep of the cabin, looking out at the wall of trees, wondering what lay beyond the next ridge, and the ridge after that. The Kentucky of Lincoln's birth was a place of transition. The old frontier heroes like Daniel Boone were becoming legends, and the new era of commerce and law was slowly creeping westward. It was a rugged, beautiful, and often cruel world. It was a world where a simple infection could be fatal, where the crop could fail because of a late frost, and where a family's entire future could be erased by a clerical error in a distant courthouse. This environment, the combination of his father's craftsmanship, his mother's soulful intellect, and the harsh, beautiful reality of the wilderness, was the crucible. It created a man who was as tough as the hickory trees he chopped, yet as sensitive as the water in the sinking spring. As the embers of the fire in the Lincoln cabin fade to a soft, pulsing orange, feel yourself drifting into that same quiet stillness. The forest is peaceful. The work of the day is done. The tall trees are standing guard over the small cabin, and the world is waiting for the boy to grow. Take another slow, deep breath. The air in your room is cool and still, just like the air of the Kentucky woods at twilight. You are safe, you are comfortable, and you are far away from the pressures of the modern world. Let the image of the flickering candle and the scent of wood smoke carry you deeper into relaxation. The story is moving forward, the seasons are turning, and the little boy by the spring is beginning to dream of the wide world that waits for him. By the time Abraham was 2 years old, the family moved a few miles away to a place called Knob Creek. If you were to stand there today, you would see a valley cradled by high, steep hills, what the locals called knobs, that seemed to lean in as if to listen to the secrets of the people below. This was a richer land than Sinking Spring, with soil that felt like velvet between the fingers and a creek that sang over the stones. It was here that Abraham's earliest vivid memories began to take root. like the hardy corn his father planted in the narrow strips of flat ground. Imagine a young boy, perhaps 5 or 6, helping his father drop seeds into the earth. It was a repetitive, meditative task. But on the frontier, nature was never entirely predictable. One afternoon, a sudden, violent summer thunderstorm sent a wall of water rushing down the hills, washing away the seeds and the topsoil in a single muddy surge. Abraham watched, wide-eyed, as the work of weeks vanished in minutes. It was a lesson in the fragility of effort, a theme that would echo throughout his life. Yet life at Nog Creek wasn't all toil. There was a simple, rustic joy in the landscape. You could almost feel the sun-warmed dust between a young boy's toes as he ran toward the creek. It was during these years that a small, humanizing event occurred that nearly changed the course of history before it had truly begun. Abraham, always curious and perhaps a bit clumsy in his growing limbs, was trying to coon across Nog Creek on a log when he lost his balance and fell into the swollen, churning water. He couldn't swim. He was being swept away, his small hands clawing at the air, when his childhood friend, a boy named Austin Gallagher, ran along the bank. Austin grabbed a long sycamore branch and held it out over the water, screaming for Abraham to catch hold. With a desperate strength, the young Lincoln gripped the wood and was pulled, shivering and gasping, onto the muddy bank. One wonders what Austin Gallagher thought in later years, watching that same boy lead a nation, knowing that a single sycamore branch had been the only thing standing between the future president and a nameless grave in the Kentucky silt. In 1816, when Abraham was 7, the family's world shifted again. 1816 was famously known as the year without a summer, a time of strange, atmospheric chills caused by a massive volcanic eruption halfway around the globe. Amidst this eerie, cold gloom, Thomas Lincoln decided to leave Kentucky forever. The legal battles over land titles had become too much, and across the Ohio River lay the Northwest Territory, a place where the government surveyed the land properly and where, crucially, slavery was prohibited. Thomas wanted a world where a man's labor belonged to himself alone. They crossed the wide gray ribbon of the Ohio River on a flatboat, a journey that felt like crossing into another world. On the Indiana side, the forest was even denser, a wild region, Lincoln later called it, filled with bears and other wild animals. They had to hack a path through the brush just to reach the spot where they would build their new home. For the first few months, they lived in what was called a half-faced camp, a 3-sided brush shelter with a fire burning constantly at the open end to keep the panthers and the cold at bay. Imagine the sound of the wind howling through the trees, the smell of burning hickory, and the feeling of huddling close to your family as the stars wheeled overhead. It was a life reduced to its absolute essentials: warmth, salt, and the presence of others. At the center of this world was Nancy Hanks Lincoln. She was the one who kept the flickering flame of the spirit alive in the dark Indiana woods. She was a woman of extraordinary intellect, by all accounts, though she remains a bit of a ghost in the historical record. Some biographers still wonder about her true origins, debating whether she was the illegitimate daughter of a high-born Virginia planter, which some suggest might explain the refined and analytical mind her son seemingly inherited. Regardless of her pedigree, she was the one who encouraged Abraham to look beyond the trees. In the quiet hours, by the light of a tallow dip, she would recite the Bible or tell stories that kindled the boy's imagination. But the frontier was a place of sudden, quiet shadows. In the autumn of 1818, a mysterious and terrifying illness began to sweep through the settlement at Pigeon Creek. It was known as the milk sickness. Cattle would wander aimlessly, trembling and weak, and soon after, the humans who drank their milk would fall into a deep, agonizing lethargy. We know now that it was caused by the white snakeroot plant, which contains a toxin called trematol. But to the settlers then, it felt like a curse from the earth itself. Nancy went to nurse her aunt and uncle who had fallen ill, and soon the sickness claimed her as well. You can imagine the heavy silence in that log cabin. There were no doctors, no medicines, only the sound of a mother's labored breathing and the sight of a 9-year-old boy sitting by the bed, helpless. On October 5th, Nancy called Abraham and his sister Sarah to her side. She told them to be good and kind to each other and to their father, and then she was gone. The grief that followed was not the loud, performative grief of a city. It was a silent, heavy thing. Thomas Lincoln, a carpenter, had to perform one final task for his wife. He took his saws and his planes and carved a coffin out of black walnut logs. Abraham, only 9 years old, helped his father whittle the wooden pegs that held the boards together. The sound of the hammer hitting those pegs must have echoed through the woods like a heartbeat. They buried her on a high, wooded knoll, without a minister, in a grave marked only by a simple stone. For months afterward, the cabin was a place of hollow echoes. The angel mother was gone, and the light seemed to have left the Indiana clearing. Abraham became even more withdrawn, his long limbs growing faster than his clothes could keep up with. He would spend hours sitting by her grave, or lost in thought in the forest. This was the early wound that never truly healed. It was the beginning of that profound melancholy that would define his face in every photograph we have of him. It gave him a perspective that few other politicians possessed, a deep, cellular understanding that life is fragile, that loss is universal, and that the only thing we truly have is our kindness toward one another. As you listen to the rustle of your own sheets, imagine the stillness of that Indiana forest in the winter of 1818. The snow falls softly, muffling the sound of the world, covering the walnut coffin and the little cabin in a blanket of white. The boy is lonely, yes, but he is also resilient. He is beginning to find solace in the only thing that cannot be taken away, the world of thoughts and words. He is learning to endure, to wait, and to hope for a different kind of light to return. Let your mind drift now, like the smoke from a dying fire. The air is cool and peaceful. The heavy work of childhood is pausing for the night. You are tucked away, safe from the cold, safe from the shadows. The boy in the story is sleeping too, dreaming of the mother who told him he was meant for something more. And as he rests, you can rest, knowing that even in the deepest woods, there is a path forward. The year following Nancy's death was what Abraham would later call the lonesome years. Imagine a house where the fire has gone out, not just in the hearth, but in the spirit of the people living there. The cabin at Pigeon Creek had become a place of dust and neglected corners. Thomas Lincoln, a man of practical action, knew that a frontier family could not survive long without the stabilizing force of a woman's hand. In 1819, he traveled back to Kentucky, and when he returned to the Indiana clearing, the heavy wagon he drove carried a transformation. Sitting in that wagon was Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children of her own. She brought with her a wealth of luxuries that young Abraham had never seen: a real walnut bureau, a clothes chest, and a flax wheel. But more importantly, she brought a spirit of warmth and an immediate, intuitive understanding of the tall, spindly boy with the haunted eyes. Sarah looked at Abraham dirty, dressed in outgrown buckskins, and quiet, and she didn't see a chore hand. She saw a mind that was starving. She would later say, "Abe was the best boy I ever saw." She became his second mother, the one who would protect his right to be different in a world that demanded conformity to the axe and the plow. Under Sarah's care, the cabin became a home again, and Abraham's intellectual life began to bloom in the middle of the wilderness. He was a boy who lived in a state of perpetual word hunger. In a time and place where books were rarer than gold, he treated every printed page like a sacred relic. It is a well-documented historical fact that in his entire life, Abraham Lincoln had less than 1 year of formal schooling. His education came in littles, as he put it, a few weeks here and a few months there in what were called blab schools. These were tiny log huts where students of all ages sat together and studied out loud, creating a constant rhythmic blab of voices that could be heard from the woods. You can almost see him now, stretched out on the floor of the cabin as the evening shadows grow long. The only light comes from the flickering orange glow of the spicewood fire. He is using a piece of charred wood as a pencil, and the back of a large wooden shovel as his slate. When the shovel was covered in letters and numbers, he would take a knife, shave off a thin layer of the wood to create a fresh surface, and begin again. He was obsessed with the precision of language. He would hear a word or a concept he didn't understand, and he would walk for miles repeating it to himself, turning it over like a smooth stone, until he could put it into plain language for anyone to understand. There is a wonderfully humanizing story from this time about his first real debt of honor. He had borrowed a book, The Life of George Washington, by Mel Weems, from a neighbor named Josiah Crawford. He took the book to bed with him, tucking it into a crack between the logs of the cabin for safekeeping. But during the night, a fierce Indiana rainstorm blew in, and the water seeped through the chinking, soaking the book until its pages were swollen and stained. Most boys would have been terrified, but Abraham was heartbroken. He walked to Crawford's house, showed him the damage, and offered to work off the cost. For 3 days, he pulled fodder and husked corn in Crawford's fields to pay for the book. It became his first owned treasure, a symbol of the value of labor and the price of knowledge. Yet this passion for reading created a quiet, simmering tension within the family. Some biographers still wonder about the true depth of the friction between Abraham and his father, Thomas. To Thomas, a man whose life was defined by the physical mastery of the forest, a son who sat under a tree reading while there was brush to be burned, looked suspiciously like a son who was lazy. Thomas was known to occasionally knock Abraham off his stool or destroy his books in a fit of frustration, trying to beat the learning out of him so he could focus on the farm. Was Thomas a cruel man? Or was he simply a man of his time, terrified that his son was becoming someone who wouldn't be able to survive the harsh reality of the frontier? This gap between the father's pragmatism and the son's intellectual dreaming was a silent wound that Lincoln carried with him, leading to a distant relationship that never fully healed. To escape this tension, Abraham often retreated into his own mind. He became a solitary, a boy who could spend hours leaning against a fence post, lost in a reverie. But when he did speak, he was a magnet for the other settlers. Even as a teenager, he was developing the gift of the yarn. He would stand on a tree stump during a break from work and mimic the local preachers or politicians, his high, reedy voice carrying across the fields. He found that humor was a bridge. It could dissolve anger and make the heavy work of clearing the forest feel a little lighter. He was learning the power of the spoken word to command a room, even if that room was just a muddy clearing in the woods. As you lie in your bed tonight, imagine the texture of that world. Feel the roughness of the homespun wool against your skin, the cool air of the evening drifting through the gaps in the logs, and the absolute velvet darkness of the Indiana forest. The only sounds are the rhythmic chirping of the crickets and the soft, steady breathing of the family huddling together for warmth. In that darkness, the young Lincoln is awake, his mind a hive of activity. He is thinking about the heroes in his books, about the laws of the land he has only glimpsed in old newspapers, and about the sheer, vast possibility of the world beyond the horizon. Lincoln's hunger wasn't just for facts, it was for meaning. He wanted to know why things were the way they were. He was a boy who would stop a traveler on the road, not just to say hello, but to ask them 100 questions about where they had been and what they had seen. He was building a map of the world in his head, one conversation at a time. He was a creature of the wilderness who was slowly, surely outgrowing the woods. The early wounds, the loss of his mother, the struggle with his father, the isolation of the frontier were not breaking him. They were tempering him. Like the steel of the axe he swung every day, his character was being sharpened by the very things that sought to wear it down. He was learning the value of silence, the importance of patience, and the profound strength that comes from a mind that can find its own light, even when the fire in the hearth burns low. Let the image of the boy by the fire fade now. The shovel is tucked away, the charred stick is cold, and the books are closed for the night. The Indiana woods are peaceful, the tall trees swaying gently in a midnight breeze. You are safe in your own quiet clearing. The world is still, the air is soft, and you are invited to let go of the day's burdens, just as the young boy finally closes his eyes and lets the stories he has read carry him into a deep, dreamless rest. As the decade of the 1820s began to lean toward its end, the world of the Indiana woods started to feel too small for a young man who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall. Abraham was 19 years old, a towering figure of lean muscle and restless intellect. He had mastered the axe, the plow, and the husking peg, but his mind was constantly drifting toward the horizon. In the spring of 1828, an opportunity arrived that would finally pull him out of the forest and onto the great, pulsing arteries of the American continent, the river. James Gentry, the local merchant of Gentryville, hired Abraham to take a flatboat loaded with produced bacon, corn, and flour down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers all the way to the legendary city of New Orleans. Imagine the scene: a young man who had spent his entire life under the canopy of ancient oaks and maples, suddenly standing on the bank of the Ohio River. The water here was wide and gray, a moving road that led to places he had only read about in his borrowed books. A flatboat was not a majestic ship. It was a humble, rectangular craft, little more than a floating box made of heavy timber, steered by long, sweeping oars. As you lie there, listen to the imagined sound of that journey. It is a symphony of water, the rhythmic slap-slap of the river against the wooden hull, the long, low creak of the steering oar, and the occasional splash of a jumping fish. The river has its own pulse, a slow and steady heartbeat that matches the pace of your own breathing. For weeks, Abraham and James Gentry's son, Alan, floated through a landscape that was constantly shifting. They passed small river towns that smelled of coal smoke and wet wool, and vast stretches of cypress swamps with the Spanish moss hung like gray ghosts from the branches. Lincoln was the bow hand on this voyage, a role that required immense physical strength and constant vigilance. He had to watch for sawyers, fallen trees rooted in the riverbed that could pierce a hole in seconds, and snags that lurked just beneath the surface. His physical power was already becoming a legend along the riverbanks. It is a quirky, humanizing detail of his youth that Lincoln was known to be able to lift a heavy wooden barrel of flour nearly 200 pounds and carry it with ease, or even lift a box of stones that 3 grown men couldn't budge. Yet despite this strength, he was never a bully. He moved with a strange, careful grace, as if he were still getting used to how far his limbs reached. The journey was not without its shadows. One night, while the boat was tied up at a plantation wharf along the sugar coast of Louisiana, the 2 young men were woken by the sound of muffled footsteps. A group of 7 men had boarded the boat, intent on robbery and perhaps worse. In the dark, chaotic struggle that followed, Abraham used his incredible reach and strength to fend them off, eventually chasing them into the woods. He carried a physical scar from that night, a mark near his temple for the rest of his life. But the emotional scars of the trip were yet to come. As the flatboat drifted further south, the air changed. It became heavy, humid, and sweet, with the scent of blooming magnolias and rotting vegetation. And then, finally, New Orleans appeared on the horizon. To a boy from a log cabin, New Orleans was like a vision from another planet. It was a kaleidoscope of sights and sounds. The narrow cobblestone streets of the French Quarter, the melodic chatter of French and Spanish, the vibrant colors of the markets, and the ships from all over the world docked at the levee. It was here that Abraham saw his first real wealth and his first real horror. In the middle of this bustling, beautiful city, Lincoln encountered the slave markets. He saw men, women, and children chained together, being inspected like livestock. He heard the rhythmic, cold chant of the auctioneer. For a young man raised in the free air of Indiana, who had been taught by his parents that all men should eat the bread earned by their own labor, this was a profound shock to the system. There is a famous biographical story, often told by his law partner William Herndon, that as Lincoln watched a young woman being sold on the auction block, he turned to his companions and said, "If I ever get a chance to hit that thing, I'll hit it hard." However, some biographers still wonder about the absolute truth of this cinematic moment. Was it a literal vow made in the heat of youth? Or was it a story that grew in the telling after he became the great emancipator? Regardless of whether he spoke those exact words, the sight of the dark world of the slave trade undoubtedly left a permanent mark on his moral imagination. He saw the ultimate contradiction of his country, a land of liberty that traded in human souls. The return journey was a slow trek back north, often on foot or by steamship, traveling against the current. As he walked the long miles back toward Indiana, Abraham was no longer just a woodsman. He had seen the scale of the world. He had seen the complexity of human society and the depths of human cruelty. He had seen how the river connected everything, the farms of the north and the plantations of the south, into one vast, interconnected, and troubled union. As you settle into your blankets, imagine the quiet reflection of that young man as he returned to his father's cabin. He was back in the woods, yes, but the woods could no longer hold him. He had tasted the wide world, and he had felt the weight of a great unanswered question about the soul of his nation. The river had taught him about flow, about patience, and about the hidden dangers that lie beneath the calm surface. The trial and error of his youth was beginning to shape a man of deep internal volume. He was learning that to grow, one must sometimes leave the safety of the shore and trust the current. He was learning that the path to greatness is often paved with difficult sights and exhausting labor. But for tonight, the river is calm. The flatboat is tied up safely. The sounds of the New Orleans market have faded into the distance, replaced by the familiar, comforting chirp of the Indiana crickets. The air in your room is cool and still. You are like that boat at rest, floating gently in a safe harbor. There is no current to fight tonight, no sawyers to watch for. The long journey of the day is over. Like the young Lincoln, you can let your thoughts drift and settle, knowing that the world will still be there tomorrow. But for now, the only task is to rest. Let the rhythmic memory of the river carry you away, down past the cypress trees, past the flickering lanterns on the shore, and into the deep, quiet waters of sleep. In the spring of 1830, the Lincoln family gathered their few possessions once more. Thomas Lincoln, ever restless and seeking a landscape that would finally hold his dreams of security, had heard of the rich black soil in Illinois land where the milk sickness did not reach and where the horizon felt as infinite as the sea. Abraham, now 21 and technically his own man, chose to help his father with this final migration. They traveled through the mud of a thawing prairie, a journey of 200 miles that took them into a new state and a new chapter. Imagine the slow, rhythmic creak of the ox cart wheels as they groaned through the tall grass prairies. The air here was different, less enclosed than the Indiana woods, filled with a constant wandering wind that made the grass ripple like waves. This was the Illinois country. After helping his father build one last cabin and split enough rails to fence in a small world of corn, Abraham finally did what he had been preparing to do for years. He walked away. He didn't leave in anger. He simply moved toward the sound of the river, toward a future that didn't involve his father's plow. He arrived in a tiny fledgling village called New Salem, perched on a high bluff overlooking the Sangamon River. The way he arrived was perfectly Lincoln-esque. He was navigating a flatboat for another merchant when the boat became stuck, balanced precariously on a mill dam. As the villagers gathered on the bank to watch the disaster, the tall stranger in the short trousers took charge. He had the crew unload the cargo to tilt the boat, bored a hole in the bow to let the water drain out, and then plugged it back up, sliding the craft safely over the dam. It was a display of practical genius and calm under pressure that the people of New Salem never forgot. They saw a man who could solve a problem with his head as well as his hands. Life in New Salem was a collection of experiments. Imagine the interior of the general store where Abraham first found work as a clerk. It was a small, dim space that smelled of dried tobacco, salted pork, and the sweet, earthy scent of unrefined sugar. There were bolts of calico cloth on the shelves and barrels of nails on the floor. To the villagers, Abe was a curiosity. He was the man who could outread anyone in town, but he was also the man who could outwrestle the strongest, rowdies from the nearby Clarias Grove. It was here that the famous wrestling match with Jack Armstrong occurred. It wasn't a fight of malice, but a rite of passage. In the dusty street outside the store, the two men grappled for what felt like hours, a slow-motion struggle of strength and balance. When the dust settled, Lincoln had won not just the match, but the lifelong loyalty of the very men who had challenged him. This is a mainstream historical fact of his life, that his physical prowess was his first political capital. He earned the respect of the rough-and-tumble frontier by showing them he was one of them, even if he spent his nights reading by the light of a cooper's fire. Yet, despite his popularity, Lincoln's early professional life was a series of quiet shipwrecks. He went into business with a man named William Berry, buying a store on credit. But Berry was more interested in the whiskey barrels than the ledgers, and Lincoln was more interested in his books than the customers. Before long, the business winked out. As Lincoln put it, leaving him with a mountain of debt. In an era where many men simply ran away from their creditors, Lincoln stayed. He called it his national debt, and he spent the next 15 years of his life slowly, painfully paying back every cent. Some biographers still wonder about the true nature of his mental state during these New Salem years. They ask whether his constant switching of jobs, from clerk to soldier in the Black Hawk War to postmaster to surveyor, was a sign of a man searching for his calling, or a sign of a man struggling with a deep sense of aimlessness and failure. Was his humor a mask for a soul that felt it was falling behind? Or was he intentionally sampling every facet of frontier life to build the broad understanding of human nature he would later need? As you lie there, imagine the quiet routine of the village postmaster. Since there was no official post office, Lincoln often carried the mail in his hat, that famous stovepipe hat, serving once again as a vessel for the community's connections. If he saw a neighbor who was expecting a letter, he would simply pull it from his hat and hand it over. It was a job that paid almost nothing, but it allowed him to read every newspaper that came through the village. He was drinking in the news of the world, the debates in Washington, and the shifting winds of the national soul. It was also in New Salem that he found his first intellectual mentors. There was Jack Kelso, a man who lived a life of deliberate simplicity, spending his days fishing and his evenings reciting Shakespeare and Robert Burns. Lincoln would sit on the riverbank with Kelso, the sound of the water providing a backdrop to the to be or not to be of the great plays. This was Lincoln's true college, a riverbank, a fishing pole, and the rhythmic beauty of Elizabethan English. He was learning the cadence of great language, the way a well-placed word could hold the weight of a world. One of the most humanizing details of this time was his work as a surveyor. To earn money to pay off his debts, he taught himself the complex mathematics of surveying in just 6 weeks, using borrowed books and a compass. He was out on the prairie in all weather, marking the lines of new towns and roads. You can almost feel the bite of the wind across the open plains and the sun on the back of his neck as he sighted through the transit. He was quite literally drawing the map of the future, one chain length at a time. There is a gentle, quiet humor in the stories of Honest Abe from this period. There is the well-known tale of him walking miles to return a few cents of overcharge to a customer, or the time he realized he had used a faulty weight for Lady C and closed the store immediately to bring her the correct amount. These weren't calculated moves for a future campaign. They were the actions of a man who believed that the truth was the only solid ground a person could stand on. In a world of shifting prairie grass and uncertain land titles, his word became the one thing everyone in New Salem could trust. As the moon rises over the Sangamon River, imagine the village falling into its nightly rest. The fires in the hearths are being banked for the morning. The sound of the mill wheel has stopped. The tall, thin man is sitting on the steps of the store, looking up at the same stars you see tonight. He is a man who has failed at business, who is deeply in debt, and who has no clear path forward. Yet, he is not diminished. He is absorbing the stories of his neighbors, the wisdom of the poets, and the hard, clean logic of the mathematics he has mastered. The air in your room is soft and cool. You are tucked away from the demands of the world, just as New Salem was tucked away on its bluff. The trial and error of the day is over. Like Lincoln, you have done what you could with the tools you had. There is a profound peace in knowing that growth often looks like a series of small, quiet mistakes. It is the slow shaping of the soul. Let the image of the quiet village and the silver river carry you toward sleep. The path is being marked. The lines are being drawn, and for now, the only thing left to do is to close your eyes and trust the journey. In the quiet, golden light of the late afternoon on the Illinois prairie, the grass grows so tall that it can brush against the stirrups of a man on horseback. It is a world of horizontal lines and shifting colors, emerald in the spring, a parched, dusty gold by August. In 1832, this was the stage where Abraham Lincoln began to find the voice that would eventually echo through the halls of history. He was 23 years old, and he had decided, with the mixture of trepidation and the little engine of ambition that his law partner would later say knew no rest, to run for the state legislature. Imagine his first real political speech, delivered at a place called Pappsville. He was not a polished orator. He didn't have the booming, theatrical baritone of the great statesmen of the East. His voice was high-pitched, almost reedy, and it carried a thick, rural twang. But as he stood on a box to address a crowd of sun-reddened farmers and rugged woodsmen, something unexpected happened. A fight broke out in the crowd, a common occurrence in the high-spirited atmosphere of frontier politics. One of Lincoln's supporters was being handled roughly. Without losing his composure, the tall candidate stepped down from his box, strode into the fray, grabbed the primary instigator by the neck and the seat of his trousers, and literally tossed him 10 feet away. He then stepped back onto his box, brushed off his hands, and began his speech as if nothing had happened. It was a moment of raw physical authority that served as the perfect preamble to his words. His platform was humble. He spoke of improving the Sangamon River, of education, and of the need for a government that was as honest as a day's labor. He lost that first election, finishing 8th in a field of 13. But in his own precinct of New Salem, he received 277 out of 300 votes. The people who knew him best, who saw him reading under the trees or returning, those few cents of overcharge believed in him. This loss was not a crushing blow, but a trial heat. It taught him that while physical strength gained respect, it was the clarity of an argument that gained power. During this time, a quiet intellectual revolution was taking place inside him. One day, while working at the store, he bought a barrel of odds and ends from a traveler for 50 cents. At the bottom of that barrel, beneath the old clothes and rusted tools, he found a complete set of Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England. To Lincoln, this wasn't just a book. It was a map of the human conscience. He began to study the law with a quiet, almost religious intensity. He didn't have a teacher or a classroom. He would take his books out into the fields, lie on his back with his long legs resting high up against the trunk of a tree, and read law until the sun dipped below the horizon. A quirky, humanizing detail from these years involves his appearance. Lincoln was acutely aware that he was not a handsome man. He described himself as homely, with a face that looked as though it had been weathered by 1,000 storms. He often used this as a tool of warmth. He once told a story about meeting a man in the woods who leveled a shotgun at him. When Lincoln asked why, the man said, "I promised years ago that if I ever met a man uglier than myself, I'd shoot him." Lincoln supposedly pulled open his shirt and said, "If I am uglier than you, then fire away, for I don't want to live." This ability to laugh at himself disarmed his rivals and made the great man seem approachable, a neighbor who just happened to be brilliant. In 1834, he ran again, and this time he won. He borrowed money to buy his first suit of clothes, a simple, dark outfit that felt stiff and strange against a body accustomed to buckskin and linsey woolsey. He began to make the trek to the state capitol in Vandalia, and it was there that he met a man who had become his greatest rival, Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas was short, polished, and fiery, the little giant. Lincoln was the Long Nine, a nickname given to him and his tall colleagues. They were opposites in every way, yet they shared a profound obsession with the future of the country. Some biographers still wonder about the true origins of Lincoln's unshakable honesty. Was Honest Abe a carefully crafted political persona? A brand designed to stand out in a world of slippery frontier dealings? Or was it something more primal, a psychological necessity for a man who felt the chaos of his own inner melancholy and needed the absolute rigidity of the truth to keep himself anchored? Some suggest his obsession with the truth was a reaction to the messy, unreliable world of his father, a way to build a life on a foundation that could never be pulled out from under him. As he began to practice law, moving from New Salem to the larger town of Springfield, his reputation for integrity became his greatest asset. He was known as the lawyer who would refuse a case if he thought the client was lying. He once told a potential client, "I can't take your case. You're a knave." I could win it, perhaps, but all the time I'd be thinking, "Lincoln, you're a liar," and I'd forget myself and say it out loud. You can almost feel the quiet, cool air of a 19th century courtroom, the smell of floor wax and old paper, the rhythmic thump of a gavel, and the silence that fell over the room when the tall man stood up to speak. He didn't use big words to confuse. He used small words to clarify. He spoke in parables, telling stories that made complex legal points feel like common sense. His mind was becoming a precision instrument. He loved the logic of Euclid's geometry, and he would often stay up late into the night by a single candle, working through mathematical proofs to sharpen his reasoning. He wanted his arguments to be demonstrated, not just asserted. This was the shaping of the mind phase of his life. He was no longer just a boy from the woods. He was a man of the law, a man who believed that language, when used with surgical precision, could heal a fractured world. As you listen to the steady, calm pace of this story, imagine the night falling over the town of Springfield. The streets are quiet now, the horses are in their stalls, and the gaslights, if there are any, flicker low. Lincoln is in his small office, perhaps sitting with his feet on the desk, looking out at the dark square. He is a man who has found his footing. He is no longer failing at business. He is succeeding at the much more difficult business of being himself. He has found that his wit, his height, and his honesty are not burdens, but tools. The air in your room is still, and your own thoughts are beginning to slow down, matching the quiet rhythm of a town at rest. There is a profound comfort in the idea of a life being built slowly, piece by piece, out of loss and study and simple, honest labor. You don't need to have all the answers tonight. You don't need to see the end of the road. Like the young lawyer in Springfield, you can trust that the work you have done today is enough. Let the image of the tall grass on the prairie return to your mind. It sways gently in the midnight breeze, a vast, whispering sea of green and gold. The world is large, and the stars are bright, and you are a part of a long, continuing story. The voice of the frontier is softening. The debates are over, and the legal briefs are tucked away. It is time to let the logic of the day fade into the soft, beautiful mystery of the night. The summer of 1835 in New Salem was a season of heavy, stagnant air and the relentless drone of cicadas in the trees. The prairie, usually so full of life, felt hushed, as if it were holding its breath. It was during these hot, humid months that the shadow of Abraham Lincoln's internal world A world he usually kept shuttered behind jokes and Lego logic began to spill over into his public life. This was the year he met a darkness that would never entirely leave him, a sorrow that would sit at his table for the rest of his days. And Rutledge was the daughter of the village's tavern keeper, a young woman described by those who knew her as possessing a slender, golden-haired grace and a mind that was as kind as it was bright. In the small, interconnected world of New Salem, she and Abraham had become close. They shared books, they shared quiet walks by the Sangamon River, and they shared a sense of quiet ambition. History tells us that Anne was once betrothed to another man, a merchant who had traveled east and failed to return, leaving her in a state of social limbo. It was Abraham who stepped into that space, offering a steady, gentle companionship. But as the August heat reached its peak, a bilious fever, which we now know was typhoid, began to sweep through the village. The water in the wells grew low and foul, and the air in the small cabins became thick with the scent of vinegar and medicinal herbs. Anne fell ill. For days, she lingered in a dim room while Abraham waited outside, his long frame pacing the dusty road. When he was finally allowed to see her for one last time, the conversation was private, a secret buried with them both. Shortly after, on August 25, 1835, Anne Rutledge passed away. The mainstream historical fact is that this death triggered the first of Lincoln, as major collapses into clinical melancholy. He did not simply grieve, he came undone. He was found wandering the woods alone, muttering to himself, or sitting for hours by her grave in the Concord Cemetery as the rain soaked through his clothes. He told a friend that he could not endure the idea of the rain falling on her, a thought so literal and agonizing that it bordered on a break from reality. His friends in New Salem were so deeply alarmed by his state of mind that they formed a sort of watch. They removed knives, razors, and ropes from his reach, fearing that the tall man with the hollow eyes might take his own life in a fit of despair. It is here that we encounter one of the great mind's most persistent mysteries. Some biographers still wonder whether the romance of Lincoln and Anne Rutledge was a true, deep engagement of souls, or if it was a story later amplified and mythologized by his law partner, William Herndon, to provide a poetic origin for Lincoln's lifelong sadness. Was she the only woman he ever truly loved, as some legends claim, or was she simply a dear friend whose death acted as a lightning rod for all the day? Unresolved grief he still carried for his mother and his sister? We may never know the clinical truth, but the emotional truth is written in the way Lincoln changed after that summer. He became a man who lived on more intimate terms with death than with life. During this period of recovery, Lincoln found a strange, haunting comfort in poetry. There was one poem in particular, Mortality, written by William Knox, that became his lifelong companion. He learned it by heart and would recite it in a low, rhythmic monotone to anyone who would listen. You can almost hear his voice now, high and thin, echoing in a quiet room. Oh, why should the spirit of mortal be proud? Like a swift fleeting meteor, a fast-flying cloud, a flash of the lightning, a break of the wave, he passeth from life to his rest in the grave. He didn't find the poem depressing. He found it grounding. It was a reminder that all suffering and all greatness is temporary. It was the logic of the graveyard applied to the living world. A quirky, humanizing detail of his grief was his sudden, intense need for the company of the stars. In the weeks after Anne's death, when he wasn't wandering the woods, he would sit for hours on the steps of a cabin, staring up at the constellations. He found a peculiar solace in the vast, cold distance of the universe. To a man whose heart felt like a leaden weight, the weightlessness of the stars was a relief. He began to see human life as a tiny, flickering candle in a very large and very dark room. This perspective didn't make him nihilistic, it made him patient. If life was short and full of sorrow, then the only meaningful thing to do was to be kind, to be honest, and to ease the burdens of others whenever possible. As you lie in the safety of your own room, imagine the transition from the chaotic grief of that summer to the quiet, steady hum of the autumn that followed. Lincoln did eventually return to his law books and his political duties, but he returned as a man who had been hollowed out. There is a certain kind of strength that only comes after a person has been broken and put back together again. The cracks are where the light gets in, but they are also where the empathy lives. Because he had felt the ultimate weight of personal loss, he would later be able to carry the weight of a nation's casualties. His melancholy wasn't a flaw. It was a deepening of his soul's capacity. You could almost feel the cool, crisp air of the Illinois October beginning to replace the stagnant heat of August. The leaves on the oaks are turning to a deep, rusty red. The village of New Salem is settling into its evening routines. There is the sound of a distant axe, the lowing of cattle, and the soft, steady scratch of a pen on paper as the young lawyer tries to lose himself in the work of the law. He is learning to live with the hypo, as he called it, learning to walk through the world while carrying a heavy, invisible shadow. This section of his life is a reminder that even the strongest minds have moments of absolute fragility. To be great does not mean to be exempt from the human condition. It means to experience it more deeply and to find a way to continue anyway. Lincoln's moral courage, which would define his presidency, was born here, in the dirt of a cemetery and the silence of the woods. He learned that he could survive the worst thing he could imagine, and that knowledge gave him a terrifying, quiet kind of power. As the moon climbs higher over the prairie, casting a silver light over the tall grass and the wooden cabins, let your own mind find its way toward rest. The storms of the heart have a way of passing, eventually leaving behind a landscape that is still and clear. You are safe. The air in your room is peaceful. The heavy thoughts of the day are like the fast-flying clouds of the poem. They move across the sky, but the sky itself remains. Listen to the rhythmic breathing of the world at night. The cicadas have gone silent. The river continues its long, slow journey toward the sea. The tall man is finally sleeping, his books closed, his mind at temporary peace. And you, too, can let go of the spirit of mortal pride and the weights of the day. You can sink into the softness of your blankets, knowing that the stars are watching over the world, and that tomorrow is a new page, waiting to be written in the light of a new sun. As the decade of the 1830s drew to a close, Abraham Lincoln left behind the fading village of New Salem for the rising town of Springfield. Imagine the transition from a place of rough-hewn logs and river mist to a bustling prairie capital. Springfield was a town of brick chimneys, gravel roads that turned into rivers of deep, black mud in the spring, and the constant rhythmic sound of construction. There was a sense of electricity in the air, the feeling of a society being built in real time. For Lincoln, it was a place of professional triumph, but also the setting for a courtship that was as volatile and complex as the weather of the plains. It was in the high-ceilinged parlors of the Springfield elite that the tall, awkward lawyer met Mary Todd. If Lincoln was the quiet, slow-moving river, Mary was a flash of lightning. She was a daughter of the Kentucky aristocracy, refined, highly educated, and fluent in French. She possessed a sharp, biting wit and a political mind that was every bit as keen as Lincoln's. When they met at a ball in 1839, Lincoln supposedly approached her with his characteristic self-deprecating bluntness, saying, "Miss Todd, I want to dance with you in the worst way." And as Mary later remarked with a smile, he certainly did. You can almost feel the atmosphere of those early meetings, the soft glow of oil lamps, the rustle of silk dresses, and the smell of expensive tobacco and lavender water. To the outside observer, they were an impossible match. He was a man of the soil, often seen with one trouser leg tucked into a boot, and a hat that had seen better years. She was a woman of fashion and high social expectations. Yet they were drawn together by a shared language of ambition and a mutual love for poetry and political debate. Mary saw something in the lonely man that others missed, a depth of character and a latent greatness that she believed she could help bring to the surface. However, the road to the altar was not a straight one. In the winter of 1841, a dark cloud descended over their relationship. On what Lincoln would forever call the fatal 1st of January, the engagement was suddenly and somewhat mysteriously broken off. The exact reasons remain a subject of intense historical debate. Some biographers still wonder whether Lincoln's nerves simply failed him, a result of his recurring melancholy and a deep-seated fear that he could not provide the life Mary deserved, or if Mary's own volatile temper had sparked a confrontation that seemed irreparable. Whatever the cause, Lincoln once again fell into a profound depression. He described himself as the most miserable man living, claiming that if his feelings were distributed across the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on earth. He stayed in his room for weeks, the shutters closed against the pale winter sun. His friends, once again, feared for his life. But as the seasons turned, a secret reconciliation began to take place. They began meeting clandestinely at the home of a mutual friend, Simeon Francis, the editor of the Sangamon Journal. These were quiet, stolen moments away from the prying eyes of Springfield society, where they rediscovered the intellectual bond that had first united them. One of the most humanizing and quirky episodes of their entire life together occurred during this secret courtship. Mary, along with a friend, had written a series of satirical letters to the local newspaper, mocking a prominent and somewhat pompous politician named James Shields. When Shields demanded to know the identity of the author, Lincoln, in a gesture of chivalrous protection, took the blame himself. Shields, a man of fierce pride, challenged Lincoln to a duel. Because he was the one challenged, Lincoln had the right to choose the weapons. With a touch of absurd frontier humor that masked a very practical strategy, he chose cavalry broadswords of the largest size. He knew that his immense height and long arms would give him an overwhelming advantage over the much shorter Shields, allowing him to end the duel without actually having to hurt the man. On the day of the duel, as the two parties met on an island in the Mississippi River, Lincoln reached up and effortlessly lopped off a high branch from a willow tree with his sword, demonstrating his incredible reach. Shields' friends quickly realized the folly of the fight and brokered a peace. Lincoln and Shields eventually became friends, but the duel remained a private embarrassment for Lincoln, a reminder of how easily the passions of youth could lead to absurdity. On November 4th, 1842, in a simple ceremony at the home of Mary's sister, they were finally married. Lincoln's wedding ring was engraved with the words, "Love is eternal." They moved into a small room at the Globe Tavern, paying $4 a week for board, a far cry from the mansions of Mary's childhood. Eventually, they purchased the only home Lincoln would ever own, a modest frame house on the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets. Imagine the daily life in that house as the 1840s progressed. You can hear the sound of their young sons, Robert and later Eddie, running through the halls. You can see Mary, a woman of intense energy, managing the household, gardening, and constantly pushing Abraham to improve his social standing. It was not a quiet household. Both were strong-willed, and their arguments were as legendary as their reconciliations. Lincoln was a man who craved silence and solitude, often becoming lost in thought for hours, while Mary was a woman who craved engagement and emotional presence. A humanizing detail, often noted by their neighbors, was Lincoln's habit of mothering his children in a way that was unusual for the time. He was known to walk down the street with a child on each shoulder, or to be found on the floor of his parlor, letting his sons crawl over him while he tried to read a legal brief. When Mary's temper flared, often a result of her own struggles with what may have been a form of bipolar disorder, Lincoln would simply pick up a child, walk out the door, and head to his law office waiting for the storm to pass with a patient, if somewhat weary stoicism. Some biographers still wonder about the true balance of power in the Lincoln marriage. Was Mary the shrew that some of Lincoln's friends portrayed her as a woman who made his home life a secondary battlefield? Or was she the essential catalyst, the one person who refused to let him succumb to his natural lethargy and pushed him toward the national stage? It is a question that lingers in the silence between the letters they wrote to each other. What is certain is that they were a partnership of two deeply flawed, deeply brilliant people who found in each other a mirror for their own ambitions. As you lie in your bed, imagine the glow of the hearth in the Lincoln home on a cold Springfield night. The house is finally quiet. The children are asleep in the rooms upstairs. Mary is perhaps sitting by the fire, sewing, while Abraham sits at a small desk, his long legs cramped under the wood, writing a letter or studying a map. Outside, the wind of the Illinois prairie whistles against the clapboards, a reminder of the vast, wild world that still lay beyond the town limits. The story of the Lincolns in Springfield is a story of roots being planted. This was where he became a father, where he became a homeowner, and where he solidified his place in the community. He was no longer the wandering flatboatman or the bankrupt storekeeper. He was a man with a family to provide for, a house to maintain, and a wife who expected him to change the world. The air in your room is still and cool. Like the town of Springfield at midnight, the noise of the day has faded into a soft, steady hum. There is a peacefulness in the idea of a domestic life, the small, repetitive tasks of love and partnership that build the foundation for everything else. You can let go of the complexities of your own relationships tonight. You can rest in the knowledge that even the most legendary lives were built on a series of quiet, everyday choices. Let the image of the house on 8th and Jackson fade into the darkness. The fire is burning low, the ink is dry on the page, and the tall man is finally putting out the lamp. It is time to rest, to let the heart find its own quiet corner, and to dream of the long road that still lies ahead. The rhythm of Abraham Lincoln as life was not measured by the walls of a courtroom or the confines of an office, but by the slow, steady turning of carriage wheels across the Illinois mud. Twice a year, in the spring and the autumn, the lawyers of the 8th Judicial Circuit would pack their saddlebags, say their goodbyes, and set out on a journey that would last for 10 weeks at a time. Imagine the scene as the sun begins to rise over the low roof lines of Springfield. The air is crisp, carrying the faint, sweet scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Lincoln emerges from his home on 8th Street, leading his horse, a reliable, if somewhat unremarkable, animal he called Old Buck. He was a man of the road. While other lawyers of his stature were beginning to settle into the comforts of a fixed practice, Lincoln seemed to thrive in the transitory nature of the circuit. The Eighth Judicial Circuit was a vast expanse, covering nearly 400 miles in 14 counties of central and eastern Illinois. There were no paved roads, only wagon tracks that transformed into deep, axle-breaking mires when the rains came, or clouds of choking, gray dust during the heat of the summer. As you lie there, try to hear the rhythmic clop-clop of old bucks' hooves and the occasional creak of the leather harness. This was the soundtrack of Lincoln's middle years, a long meditative walk through the heart of the American prairie. One of the most humanizing and quirky details of Lincoln's traveling gear was his umbrella. It was a large, faded blue cotton contraption that had seen much better days. The handle was worn smooth by his large hands, and because the clasp was broken, he usually kept it closed by tying a piece of common white string around the middle. Stitched into the lining in large, somewhat uneven letters was his name, A. Lincoln. It was a practical, unpretentious object, much like the man himself. He would ride for hours in a daze of thought, his long legs nearly touching the ground as they dangled from the stirrups, the blue umbrella tucked under his arm like a soldier's musket. The circuit was a unique school of human nature. In every small county seat towns with names like Metamora, Bloomington, and Danville, their rival of the judge and the lawyers, was the social event of the season. The courthouse was often the only substantial building in town, a 2-story brick or frame structure that smelled of old tobacco and damp wool. Lincoln's legal work on the circuit was a kaleidoscope of the human condition. He wasn't arguing grand constitutional theories. He was dealing with the messy, everyday disputes of a frontier society. He defended people accused of horse theft, argued over the boundaries of a cornfield, and settled disputes over the ownership of a stray hog. A mainstream historical fact of his legal career is that he handled over 5,000 cases during his 25 years of practice. He was a lawyer's lawyer, respected by his peers for his ability to strip a case down to its absolute, undeniable essence. He had a way of standing before a jury, his thumbs tucked into his suspenders, and speaking with such plain, unvarnished logic that the truth seemed to emerge as if by magic. But it was the evenings that truly defined the circuit life. In those days, there were no private hotel rooms. The judge and all the lawyers would stay at the local tavern, often sleeping 3 or 4 to a bed, or on thin pallets spread across the floor of a common room. You can imagine the scene: a large stone fireplace roaring with hickory logs, the air thick with the smell of fried ham and strong coffee. This was where Lincoln was at his most vibrant. He was the undisputed master of the tavern circle. He would sit with his back to the fire, his long limbs sprawled out, and tell stories until the small hours of the morning. His laughter was a high-pitched, confectious neigh, as his friends called it, a sound that could be heard echoing through the thin walls of the inn. Some biographers still wonder about the true motivation behind Lincoln's devotion to the circuit. While other lawyers stayed home more often, as they grew older and wealthier, Lincoln remained on the road longer than almost anyone else, often staying out for the full 10 weeks. Was the circuit a refuge for him? Some scholars suggest it was an escape from a turbulent and often high-strung atmosphere of his home life with Mary Todd. Was he more at peace in the company of his male colleagues and the simple, predictable routines of the road than he was in the domestic complexities of Springfield? Or was the circuit simply the most effective way for him to build a grassroots political base, meeting every influential farmer and merchant in the state, one handshake at a time? As the night deepens in our story, imagine the quiet of the tavern room after the candles have been blown out. The only light comes from the dying embers in the hearth, casting long, wavering shadows across the ceiling. Lincoln is sharing a bed with a fellow lawyer, perhaps someone half his size, and he is likely struggling to fit his 6'4" frame under the heavy quilts. He often joked that he had to fold himself up like a jackknife to fit into a standard bed. Despite the physical discomfort, there is a profound sense of camaraderie in that room. These men were rivals in the courtroom during the day, but at night they were a brotherhood of the road. This period of his life was essential for the great mind we are exploring. It taught him how to read people, not just the elite, but the common man. He learned what moved a jury of farmers, what made a blacksmith laugh, and what a widow feared most about the law. He was building a library of human behavior that he would eventually use to lead a nation through its darkest hour. He was learning that leadership is not about being above the people, but about being among them. The air in your room is still and peaceful, much like the quiet prairie night outside the tavern windows. The long ride of the day is over. The legal briefs are tucked away in the saddlebags, and the horses are resting in the stable. There is a deep, restorative comfort in the rhythm of the journey, the knowledge that tomorrow will bring a new town, a new case, and a new set of stories to be told. You can almost feel the weight of the heavy wool blankets, the same kind Lincoln used to ward off the chill of a central Illinois night. Your body is heavy and relaxed. The clop-clop of the hooves has faded into a gentle rhythmic pulse in the back of your mind. Like the weary lawyers on the circuit, you have earned your rest. The roads are long, and the work is significant, but for now, the world is hushed. Let the image of the vast, open prairie under a canopy of stars carry you toward sleep. The horizon is wide, the air is clean, and the path forward is steady. You are traveling through history, but you are doing so from a place of absolute safety and warmth. The tall man with the blue umbrella has finally closed his eyes, and so can you. The early 1850s in Springfield were, for Abraham Lincoln, a time of quiet accumulation. After a single, somewhat underwhelming term in the United States Congress, he had returned to the Illinois prairies with a sense that his political sun had perhaps already set. He threw himself into the law with a renewed, almost obsessive focus. Imagine the interior of the Lincoln Herndon Law Office on the west side of the square. It was a space that defied the polished expectations of a successful attorney. The floor was often covered in a light layer of dust, and the desks were piled so high with papers that it seemed a stray breeze might collapse the entire system of records. A quirky and humanizing detail of this environment was the seeds that grew in the corners. His law partner, William Herndon, famously recalled that because the office was so rarely swept, enough dirt had accumulated in the floor cracks that, during a particularly damp spring, a few stray seeds actually sprouted into tiny green shoots in the middle of the room. Lincoln didn't seem to mind. He was a man who lived primarily in the world of ideas, entirely indifferent to the physical clutter around him. He would sit in his favorite chair, a worn, creaky thing, and read aloud to himself. This was one of his most distinctive habits. He said that when he read aloud, he used two senses instead of one. He could see the words and hear them, tasting the language to ensure it was as clear and honest as possible. As you lie there, listen to the imagined sound of that quiet office. It is the scratch of a steel-nibbed pen on heavy paper, the occasional rustle of a newspaper, and the low, rhythmic mumble of a man processing the thoughts of the world. For a few years, Lincoln was content to be a private citizen, a father, and a lawyer. But the world outside the dusty office windows was beginning to fracture. The great, unresolved question of the American experiment, the existence of human slavery in a land dedicated to liberty, was no longer a distant thunder. It was becoming a storm that threatened to tear the roof off the house. The turning point came in 1854 with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This law, championed by his old rival Stephen Douglas, effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise and opened the possibility of slavery spreading into the vast new territories of the West. For Lincoln, this was not just a political disagreement. It was a moral earthquake. He said it aroused him as he had never been before. The quiet accumulation of his middle years suddenly found a direction. His moral compass, which had been steady but somewhat internalized, began to point with a new, sharp intensity toward a single North Star truth: that if slavery was not wrong, then nothing was wrong. A mainstream historical fact of this period is Lincoln's 1854 speech in Peoria, Illinois. It was here that he first fully articulated his evolving philosophy. He spoke for over 3 hours, his voice growing stronger as the sun set over the Illinois River. He didn't just attack the logistics of the law. He attacked the moral logic behind it. He argued that the spirit of the nation was being poisoned, and that the monstrous injustice of slavery deprived the country of its just influence in the world. He was no longer just a clever lawyer or a storytelling politician. He was becoming a prophet of the American soul. Yet, some biographers still wonder about the true nature of this awakening. They ask, was Lincoln's opposition to slavery born from a pure, egalitarian heart that had always beaten for the oppressed, or was it a gradual, pragmatic evolution? Some scholars suggest that his primary motivation was the preservation of the American dream, the idea that a poor boy from a log cabin should have the right to the fruits of his own labor, a right that was fundamentally undermined by a system of forced labor. Did he hate slavery because he loved the slave, or because he loved the idea of a free society where labor was dignified for everyone? This nuance does not diminish his greatness, but it humanizes the struggle of a man trying to align his deep-seated legal mind with his growing moral conscience. As you settle deeper into your blankets, imagine the weight of this reflection. Lincoln was a man who didn't reach conclusions quickly. He was like a slow-moving glacier. He took his time, grinding through every counter-argument, every legal precedent, and every historical fact until his position was unshakable. He spent long, solitary nights in his office, the candle burning down to a nub as he worked out the logic of liberty. He was reading the founding documents, the letters of Jefferson, and the poetry of the age, searching for the words that could bridge the gap between the world as it was and the world as it ought to be. One can almost feel the cooling air of a Springfield autumn evening. The town is quiet, the bustle of the courthouse is faded, and the tall man is walking home to 8th Street. His head is bowed, his hands are tucked behind his back, and he is oblivious to the neighbors who tip their hats to him. He is carrying the weight of a deepening conviction. He knows that his life is about to change, that he can no longer remain in the comfortable shadows of a private legal practice. He is stepping into a larger, more dangerous arena. But for tonight, that arena is still a few years away. The storm is still building on the horizon. In the Lincoln home, the lamp is finally extinguished. The tiny green shoots in the cracks of the office floor are resting in the dark. The moral compass has been calibrated, the path has been chosen, and the mind is steady. There is a profound, quiet strength in a person who has finally found their purpose. It is a strength that doesn't need to shout. It simply waits for the moment to act. The air in your room is peaceful and still. Your own journey for the day has reached its quiet conclusion. Like the lawyer in Springfield, you have processed the events of your life. You have felt the shifting winds of your own convictions, and you have reached a place of temporary rest. There is nothing more to solve tonight. The logic of the day is giving way to the soft, intuitive wisdom of sleep. Let the image of the flickering candle and the dusty books fade into the velvet darkness. The prairie is vast and silent. The stars are watching over the fracturing union, and the man who will save it is sleeping, gathering the strength he will soon need for the greatest struggle of his life. You, too, can gather your strength. You can let your mind drift, knowing that you are grounded in your own truth, safe in your own bed, and ready for the rest that you have earned. By the summer of 1858, the Illinois prairie had become a pressure cooker of political and moral tension. The winds that swept across the tall grass carried more than just the scent of clover and dust. They carried the heated arguments of a nation trying to decide what it was going to be. Abraham Lincoln was now 49 years old. The deep lines in his face had become permanent canyons, and his eyes seemed to hold a weary, ancient light. He had been chosen by the newly formed Republican Party to challenge the little giant Stephen A. Douglas for his seat in the United States Senate. The campaign began with a speech that many of Lincoln's friends warned him was too radical, too dangerous. On a humid June evening in Springfield, inside the candlelit hall of the State House, Lincoln stood before his colleagues and uttered the words that would define the rest of his life. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. It was a staggering statement of clarity. While other politicians tried to find middle ground in the shifting sands of compromise, Lincoln had drawn a line in the black Illinois soil. He was saying that the conflict was not a temporary disagreement, but a fundamental struggle for the soul of the Republic. As you lie there, imagine the silence that must have fallen over that room, the sound of the heavy night air pressing against the windows, the soft hiss of the candles, and the realization among the listeners that the world had just changed. The 7 great debates. To settle the matter, Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of joint debates. Across 7 different towns from the northern reaches of Ottawa to the southern tip of Alton, the two men engaged in a marathon of logic and oratory. Imagine the atmosphere of these events. They were not the polite, televised affairs of the modern era. They were grand, chaotic festivals of democracy. People traveled for days in wagons and on horseback to hear them. The air was thick with the smell of parched earth, horse sweat, and the wood smoke from 100 campfires. There were brass bands, fluttering banners, and crowds of 10,000 people standing for hours under a relentless sun. A quirky and humanizing detail of these debates was the sheer physical contrast between the two men. Douglas was a cannonball of a man, dressed in expensive linen and fine ruffled shirts, exuding the confidence of a king. Lincoln, by contrast, often looked as though he had just stepped out of a hayloft. His coat sleeves were always a few inches too short, revealing his large, bony wrists, and his trousers rarely reached his ankles. When he sat down on the wooden platform while Douglas spoke, he would often wrap his long arms around his knees, looking like a giant folding ruler. But when Lincoln stood to speak, the transformation was magnetic. He didn't start with a roar. He would begin slowly, almost tentatively, as if he were feeling his way through a difficult problem. But as he warmed to his subject, his body would straighten, his voice would sharpen, and his eyes would flash with an intense internal fire. He was using the logic he had honed on the Eighth Circuit and the geometry of Euclid to dismantle Douglas' arguments. He was forcing the audience to look past the legalities and see the moral wrong of human bondage. The solitude of the rail. Despite the public spectacle, much of Lincoln's experience during the debates was deeply solitary. While Douglas traveled in a magnificent private train car, decorated with banners and equipped with a small cannon to announce his arrival, Lincoln often traveled on ordinary passenger trains, or even in the caboose of freight cars. You can imagine him sitting on a hard wooden bench as the train rattled across the midnight prairie. The only light would be a single lantern swaying from the ceiling, casting rhythmic, dancing shadows across the pages of his newspaper. In these quiet hours between the crowds and the noise, the melancholy would return. His friends often noted that on these train rides, Lincoln would sit in a state of profound reverie, staring out the window at the dark, flat horizon for hours, his lips moving silently as he practiced his arguments or recited poetry to himself. Some biographers still wonder what he was thinking in those moments. Was he imagining the war that his house-divided speech had made more likely? Was he mourning the quiet life of the Springfield lawyer that he was surely leaving behind? Or was he simply exhausted, a man of 50 carrying the weight of a moral cause that felt increasingly heavy? One of the most humanizing stories from this campaign involves a young boy who saw Lincoln on a train. The boy noticed that the great man looked incredibly sad, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly. But when the boy gathered the courage to approach him, Lincoln's face instantly broke into a warm, crinkly smile. He pulled the boy onto his knee and told him a story about a squirrel he had seen earlier that day. This was the duality of Lincoln, a man who felt the tragedy of the world in his bones, yet could always find a way to make a child laugh. The long walk toward tomorrow. Lincoln ultimately lost that Senate race. In those days, senators were chosen by the state legislature, and while Lincoln's party won the popular vote, Douglas's party held more seats. On the night the results came in, Lincoln walked home through a cold, drenching rain. The streets of Springfield were slippery with mud, and he famously stumbled, nearly falling into a ditch. He righted himself and thought, "It's a slip and not a fall." This resilience is the heartbeat of our story tonight. He had lost the office, but he had won something much more significant. He had become a national figure. His words had been printed in newspapers from Maine to California. He had forced the country to look in the mirror, and the reflection was one they could no longer ignore. As you lie in your bed, feel the quiet stillness that follows the end of a great effort. The cheering crowds of the debates have gone home. The brass bands have stopped playing. The dust has settled over the 7 towns of Illinois. There is a profound peace in knowing that even in defeat, a seed of truth has been planted. Your room is cool and safe. The house divided of the day's worries is no longer your concern. You can let the tension in your shoulders dissolve into the mattress. Like the prairie after a summer storm, your mind can become clear and refreshed. The long journey of 1858 is over, and the even longer journey of the 1860s is still a heartbeat away. Take a slow, deep breath. The rhythmic clack-clack of the train on the tracks is a soothing lullaby, carrying you further and further away from the noise of the world. The tall man in the freight car has finally closed his eyes, leaning his head against the wooden wall, the swaying lantern casting a soft, golden glow over his tired face. He is resting, and so can you. The stars are bright over the Illinois fields, and the world is waiting for the sun to rise on a new chapter. But for now, there is only the night, the silence, and the deep, restorative sleep that you have earned. The winter of 1860 began not with a roar, but with a quiet, scholarly journey eastward. While the political fires were smoldering in the West, Abraham Lincoln accepted an invitation to speak at the Cooper Institute in New York City. Imagine the contrast. The man from the mud-caked streets of Springfield arriving in the sophisticated, gas-lit heart of Manhattan. He arrived wearing a new suit that had been packed too tightly in his trunk, leaving it covered in stubborn wrinkles that no amount of brushing could smooth away. To the fashionable New Yorkers, he looked like a strange, prehistoric bird, tall, angular, and slightly out of place. But when he stood before the audience of 1,500 people, the wrinkles in his suit seemed to vanish beneath the weight of his words. He spoke with a cool, surgical logic, tracing the history of the Founding Fathers to prove that they had always intended for the federal government to have the power to restrict slavery. It was a performance of pure intellect. By the time he sat down, the rail splitter from Illinois had conquered the intellectual capital of America. This speech was the spark. As he traveled back toward the prairie, the whisper of Lincoln for president began to grow into a rhythmic chant. The strategy of the wigwam. In May 1860, the Republican National Convention gathered in Chicago in a massive, temporary timber structure called the wigwam. The air inside was thick with the scent of fresh pine sawdust and the nervous energy of thousands of delegates. Lincoln, following the custom of the time, stayed home in Springfield, waiting for news by telegraph. He told his friends he was too superstitious to attend, while his rivals' men, like the polished William Seward of New York, arrived with brass bands and champagne. Lincoln's managers used the home field advantage of Illinois. They printed counterfeit tickets to pack the hall with Lincoln supporters whose shouts were described as 1,000 steam whistles. When the news finally reached the telegraph office in Springfield that Lincoln had won the nomination on the third ballot, he was sitting in a quiet chair. He didn't cheer. He stood up, folded the telegram, and said simply, "Well, gentlemen, there is a little woman at our house who is more interested in this than I am." And he walked home to tell Mary. The transformation of a face, as the campaign of 1860 began, a quirky and deeply humanizing event occurred that changed the very way we visualize Abraham Lincoln today. Throughout his entire life, he had been clean-shaven. But in October, he received a letter from an 11-year-old girl in Westfield, New York, named Grace Bedell. "I have 4 brothers," she wrote, "and some of them will vote for you anyway. And if you let your whiskers grow, I will try and get the rest of them to vote for you. You would look a great deal better, for your face is so thin. All the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president." Lincoln, a man who rarely took advice on his appearance, found the letter charming. He replied to her, asking if it would not be seen as a piece of silly affection for him to change now. But privately, as he sat before his mirror in the quiet of his bedroom, he began to let the stubble grow. By the time he left for Washington, the famous beard, the whiskers that would become a symbol of his wisdom and gravity, had taken shape. Image showing the evolution of Abraham Lincoln's facial hair from 1860, clean-shaven, to 1861, full beard. The quiet vigil election night, November 6, 1860, was a study in stillness. Lincoln spent the evening in the telegraph office in Springfield, the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the machines providing the heartbeat of the night. As the returns came in from the North Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, it became clear the House divided had spoken. Lincoln had won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. The victory was heavy. As he walked home at 2 in the morning, the streets were deserted. The excitement of the victory was already being overshadowed by the dark news from the South. talk of secession was no longer a threat. It was becoming a reality. He went into his bedroom, where Mary was sleeping, and woke her gently. He later told a friend that a heavy sense of responsibility settled over him that night, a weight that would never lift until the day he died. A journey of destiny. The 3 months between the election and the inauguration were some of the most agonizing of his life. 7 states seceded from the Union before he even took the oath of office. In February 1861, he prepared to leave Springfield forever. Imagine the morning of February 11th. A cold, drizzling rain is falling on the Great Western Railroad station. A crowd of his friends and neighbors has gathered, their umbrellas a sea of black silk. Lincoln stands on the rear platform of the train, his face etched with a sadness that seems deeper than the gray sky. He speaks without notes, his voice trembling slightly. To this place, and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. I now leave, not knowing when, or whether ever, I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. As the train pulled away, the rhythmic chuff-chuff of the engine echoing through the prairie, Lincoln began a 12-day journey to Washington, a journey that was part celebration and part gauntlet. He had to balance the need to reassure the public with the very real threat of assassination. In Baltimore, the danger was so high that he had to be spirited through the city in the middle of the night, disguised in a soft felt hat and a long coat, arriving in Washington like a thief in the night, as his critics cruelly put it. As you lie there, imagine the interior of that train car at night. The wood-burning stove in the corner provides a dry, flickering warmth. The windows are frosted with the breath of the passengers. Lincoln is sitting in the corner, his long legs stretched out into the aisle. He is reading the drafts of his inaugural address, his pen moving slowly as he softens the language, trying to find a way to reach the better angels of our nature. The air in your room is still. The task greater than Washington's is not yours to carry tonight. Like the train moving through the dark landscape of 1861, you are being carried toward a destination of rest. The rails are steady, the path is set, and the world outside the window is a blur of shadows and light. The tall man with the new beard has finally set aside his papers. He is looking out at the dark American forest, his mind a hive of prayers and strategies, but his body finally surrendering to the fatigue of the journey. He is resting his head against the seat, the rhythmic swaying of the carriage acting as a heavy iron lullaby. You can let the sounds of the modern world fade away. There are no telegraphs to read, no speeches to give, and no union to save tonight. You are tucked safely in your bed, far from the storms of history. The better angels are watching over you, and the long road of the day has come to its peaceful end. Let the image of the train's golden lantern, disappearing into the mist of the distance, lead you into sleep. The journey is long, but for now, the engine is quiet, the station is reached, and the rest you have earned is waiting for you in the soft, velvet silence of the night. Would you like me to continue with the inauguration and the first difficult days of the Civil War at the White House? Imagine the morning of March 4th, 1861. Washington, D.C. was not yet the marble city of monuments we know today. It was a swampy, humid town of dirt roads and half-finished dreams. As Abraham Lincoln rode in an open carriage toward the Capitol building, the scene was one of profound tension. Sharpshooters were stationed on the rooftops, and cavalry patrolled the intersections. The Capitol itself stood as a stark skeletal metaphor for the nation. Its great iron dome was unfinished, surrounded by cranes and piles of lumber, open to the sky. Lincoln stood on a wooden platform, before a crowd that was hushed and wary. He took the oath of office administered by Chief Justice Roger Taney, the same man who had written the Dred Scott decision that Lincoln so loathed. As he stepped to the podium, he paused. He was wearing his new black suit and his tall hat, and he found he had no place to set his cane. In a small, humanizing gesture that whispered of a fading era of civility, his old rival Stephen Douglas reached out and took the hat, holding it for Lincoln as he began to speak. His first inaugural address was a masterpiece of restraint and plea. He spoke directly to the South, not as enemies, but as brothers. He told them, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." He ended with the famous, poetic appeal to the better angels of our nature. Yet, as the cheers died down and the carriage carried him toward his new home at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the better angels seemed very far away. The great White House, chaos, the White House of 1861, then called the Executive Mansion, was not a private sanctuary. It was a public building that smelled of dampness, old tobacco, and cabbage. In those days, there was almost no security. Anyone could walk through the front door, wander up the stairs, and sit on the furniture. For the first few months, Lincoln was besieged by office seekers, thousands of men who believed that, because they had voted for him, they were entitled to a government job. The office. Lincoln worked in a large room on the second floor that served as both his office and the cabinet room. The atmosphere. Stacks of maps were leaned against the walls, and the floor was littered with newspapers. The routine. He rose early, often before the sun, to find a few moments of peace before the shouting crowd of job hunters arrived at his door. A quirky detail of his early presidency was his relationship with these office seekers. Despite the weight of the impending war, he found it difficult to turn people away. He called these meetings his public opinion baths, believing that hearing the complaints and desires of ordinary citizens kept him connected to the heart of the country. He would sit in his chair, his long legs draped over the arm, listening to a man from Iowa ask for a postmaster position, while, in the next room, his cabinet debated the logistics of a civil war. The fire at Fort Sumter. The peace lasted only 5 weeks. In Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, a small federal garrison at Fort Sumter was running out of food. The Confederacy demanded its surrender. Lincoln's cabinet was divided on whether to fight or withdraw. As you lie there, imagine the silence of the White House at night during that April. Lincoln was suffering from intense insomnia, walking the halls in his nightshirt, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, the first mortar shell arched over the harbor and exploded above the fort. The war had begun. When the news reached Washington by telegraph, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The city went from a place of debate to a place of feverish preparation. One of the most humanizing glimpses of Lincoln during this week comes from his young secretary, John Hay. He described Lincoln standing at a window, looking out across the Potomac toward the hills of Virginia, where Confederate campfires were beginning to glow. Lincoln whispered to himself, almost in a trance, "Why don't they come? Why don't they come?" He was waiting for the Northern troops to arrive to protect the capital. When the 6th Massachusetts Regiment finally marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, the relief on Lincoln's face was so profound that he was said to have wept. The weight of the crown, the transition from a prairie lawyer to a commander-in-chief, was brutal. Lincoln had no military experience beyond a few weeks of drilling in the Black Hawk War, yet he found himself responsible for the lives of hundreds of thousands. He began to spend his nights in the War Department telegraph office, a small, quiet room where he could escape the crowds of the White House. He would sit by the telegraph operator, draped in a gray shawl, waiting for the rhythmic click-click-click of the machines to tell him how his boys were faring in the field. He became a student of war, borrowing books from the Library of Congress on military strategy and staying up until dawn to study the movements of armies he had never seen. "I feel," he told a friend, "as if I am a man who has been given a great, heavy load to carry across a very thin piece of ice." As you settle into the stillness of your own room, imagine the flickering gaslights of the 1861 White House. The noise of the office seekers has finally faded. The telegraph machines are silent for a moment. The thin ice of the day's decisions is behind him, and the tall man is finally sitting in the darkness, looking out at the unfinished dome of the Capitol. He is tired a deep, bone-weary fatigue that no amount of sleep can truly touch, but he is also resolute. He has accepted the heavy load, and he is learning how to carry it. The air in Washington is thick and warm, the scent of the river drifting through the open windows. Your own room is cool and safe. You have no burdens to carry tonight, no decisions that will change the course of history. Like the city of Washington, under the cover of a wartime night, you can find a momentary peace in the shadows. The better angels are standing guard, and the long, difficult road of the 1860s is pausing for the night. Listen to the rhythmic, slow breathing of the world. The cranes at the Capitol are still. The soldiers at the river are asleep. The man in the gray shawl has finally leaned his head back against his chair, his eyes closing as the weight of the Union rests, just for a few hours, in the hands of Providence. You can let go now. You can drift into the soft, quiet safety of the night, knowing that the story is held in the hands of time. The summer of 1861 brought a brutal awakening to the North. Most people, including many in Lincoln's cabinet, believed the war would be a 90-day affair, a single decisive battle that would send the rebels home. But on a sweltering July day, just miles from Washington, the reality of the conflict shattered that illusion at the Battle of Bull Run. Imagine the scene. Washington socialites actually drove out in carriages with picnic baskets to watch the battle as if it were a sporting event. But as the sun began to set, the Union lines broke, and a panicked retreat turned into a chaotic surge of soldiers and civilians fleeing back toward the Capitol. Lincoln spent the evening in the telegraph office, receiving the fragmented, terrifying reports of the slaughter. When the defeated, mud-covered troops finally limped back into Washington, the city was paralyzed by fear. Yet, amidst the panic, Lincoln was a pillar of eerie, focused calm. He stayed up all night, sitting at his desk, writing out a memorandum for the next steps of the war. He realized that this would not be a short skirmish, but a remorseless revolutionary struggle. He began to reorganize the army, searching for a general who could match his own iron will, a search that would haunt him for years. The Silent Shadow. Willie's fever as the war grew in scale, a much more intimate tragedy began to unfold within the walls of the White House. The winter of 1862 was particularly damp and cold. In early February, Lincoln's two youngest sons, Willie and Tad, fell ill with what the doctors called bilious fever, likely typhoid caused by the contaminated water in the White House pipes. Willie was 11 years old, the brightest and best of the Lincoln children, possessing a gentle, poetic soul that reminded everyone of his father. While the president agonized over the movements of the Army of the Potomac, he spent his nights sitting by Willie's bed, cooling the boy's forehead with a damp cloth. On February 20th, 1862, Willie passed away. The grief that hit the White House was absolute. Mary Todd Lincoln was so shattered that she took to her bed for weeks, unable to attend the funeral, and would never again be able to enter the room where he died. Abraham, however, had to remain the leader of a nation in agony. A deeply humanizing and heart-wrenching detail of this time was Lincoln's reaction. He was found several times in the days following the funeral, sitting in his office with his head in his hands, sobbing, "My boy is gone. He is actually gone." He had the body of his son placed in a temporary tomb in Georgetown, and it is said that he returned there several times alone, just to be near the boy. The burden of the emancipator, this personal loss, seemed to deepen Lincoln's empathy for the thousands of families who were receiving similar news from the front lines. He began to see the war not just as a legal struggle to save the Union, but as a moral crucible. He spent more time at the soldiers' home, a cottage on a hill 3 miles from the White House where the air was cooler and the noise of the office seekers was muffled. It was during these lonely carriage rides between the White House and the soldiers' home that he began to draft the most important document of the century. He realized that to win the war, he had to strike at the heart of the rebellion, slavery. The Battle of Antietam in September 1862 was the bloodiest single day in American history. Over 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. While technically a draw, it forced the Confederate Army to retreat. For Lincoln, this was the sign from God he had been waiting for. 5 days later, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He was no longer just a president. He was becoming the great emancipator, the solace of the night. As you settle into your blankets tonight, imagine the White House in the autumn of 1862. The house is quiet, but it is a heavy, grieving silence. The laughter of the children has been replaced by the rhythmic ticking of the great clocks in the hallways. Lincoln is in his office, the only light coming from a single green-shaded lamp. He is looking at the casualty lists from Antietam, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his decisions have led to this harvest of death. But he is also looking at the draft of the proclamation, the words that would eventually turn the war into a crusade for human freedom. "I am a slow walker," he once said, "but I never walk backwards. The air in your room is peaceful. You are far from the smoke of the battlefields and the shadows of the White House corridors. Like the city of Washington under a harvest moon, the world is at rest." The slow walker is finally setting down his pen, rubbing his tired eyes, and looking out toward the Georgetown hills where his son is sleeping. Your own burdens are light tonight. There are no proclamations to sign, no armies to move, and no grief that cannot be softened by the arrival of sleep. The better angels that Lincoln called upon are watching over the world, promising that even the darkest nights eventually give way to a new, clearer morning. Listen to the stillness. The war is far away. The sorrow is a memory. The man in the White House is closing his eyes, and you can close yours too. Drift into the soft, velvet darkness, knowing that the story of courage is continuing, and that you are safe in the quiet embrace of the night. Would you like me to continue with the turning point of the war at Gettysburg and the delivery of Lincoln's most famous speech? By the summer of 1863, the weight of the war had carved even deeper grooves into Abraham Lincoln's face. His eyes, often described as two dark pools of sorrow, seemed to look past the walls of the White House toward the casualty lists that never stopped growing. In early July, 2 massive events occurred that shifted the trajectory of the Union forever: the surrender of Vicksburg in the west and the brutal 3-day struggle at Gettysburg in the east. Gettysburg was the high water mark of the Confederacy. Over 50,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing in just 72 hours. When the smoke finally cleared over the Pennsylvania wheat fields, the landscape was a nightmare of broken wagons, dead horses, and shallow graves. The local citizens, overwhelmed by the tragedy, decided to create a permanent national cemetery to honor the fallen. The few appropriate remarks. In November 1863, Lincoln was invited to attend the dedication of this cemetery. He was not the featured speaker. That honor went to Edward Everett, a famous orator of the time who was known for his soaring, 2-hour-long speeches. Lincoln was merely asked to provide a few appropriate remarks to formally set apart the grounds. Imagine the train ride from Washington to Gettysburg on November 18th. Lincoln was not feeling well. He was in the early stages of a mild form of smallpox, his head aching and his body weary. He sat in the drawing room car, surrounded by politicians and secretaries, but his mind was elsewhere. He pulled out a piece of Executive Mansion stationery and began to refine the words he had been thinking about for weeks. Contrary to the myth, he did not write the speech on the back of an envelope while on the train. He had been crafting the logic of these words in the quiet hours of his office. November 19, 1863. 2 minutes of eternity. The day of the dedication was bright and chilly. A crowd of 15,000 people stood on the hillside, surrounded by the fresh red earth of the new graves. Edward Everett spoke first, a masterpiece of 13,000 words that chronicled the history of the battle in exhaustive detail. When he finally finished and the applause died down, the tall, thin president stood up, adjusted his spectacles, and drew a single sheet of paper from his pocket. He spoke for just 2 minutes. In only 272 words, he did something Edward Everett's 2-hour speech could not. He gave the war a new meaning. The past, 77 years ago, reminding the nation of its birth in 1776. The present, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation can long endure. The future, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. A quirky, humanizing detail of the moment was the reaction. When Lincoln sat down, there was a stunned silence. He turned to his friend Ward Hill Lamon and said, "Lamon, that speech won't scour. It is a flat failure." He thought the silence meant the audience was disappointed. In reality, they were simply hushed by the profound simplicity and beauty of what they had just heard. The next day, Edward Everett wrote to him, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. The healing power of language." Gettysburg transformed the war from a struggle to restore the Union into a crusade to perfect the Union. Lincoln had used his gift for language honed by reading Shakespeare and Euclid in the Indiana woods to distill the American identity into its most essential form. As you lie in your bed, imagine the quiet of the Gettysburg Cemetery on the night after the ceremony. The crowds have gone. The brass bands have stopped playing. The moon rises over the white headstones, casting long, peaceful shadows over the ground where so much blood was spilled. Lincoln is back on the train to Washington, his fever rising, his head resting against the cool glass of the window. He is exhausted, but there is a quiet peace in his heart. He has said what needed to be said. He has connected the dead of the battlefield to the living promise of the future. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, he had said. He was wrong about that, of course. Those words would become the secular scripture of a nation. But for him, in that moment, The words were just a bridge away to find meaning in the midst of madness. The air in your room is still and cool, much like the Pennsylvania night air. You are safe, tucked away from the noise of history. Like the silent fields of Gettysburg, your mind is finding its own quiet resolution. The new birth of tomorrow is coming, but for now, the only task is to rest. Feel the heavy, rhythmic click-clack of the train carrying the president home. It is a soothing, iron heartbeat. The task is still great, and the war is not yet over, but for these few hours, the world is at peace with its own story. You can let go of the 7 worries of your own day. You can sink into the softness of your pillow, knowing that the better angels are still on duty, and that the language of the night is one of silence and rest. Close your eyes, let the torchlight fade, and drift into the deep healing sleep that follows a day of truth. Would you like me to continue with the arrival of Ulysses S. Grant in Washington and the final, grueling year of the war leading to the 1864 election? By 1864, the North was war-weary. The initial excitement of the crusade had been replaced by a grim, gray endurance. Lincoln was facing a re-election campaign in the midst of a slaughterhouse, and for the first time, he felt his grip on the presidency slipping. The people wanted an end to the dying, and the politicians were looking for a scapegoat. It was in this moment of peak darkness that Lincoln finally found the man he had been searching for since. Bull Run, Ulysses S. Grant. In March, Grant arrived in Washington to take command of all Union armies. He was a quiet, unassuming man who arrived at the Willard Hotel looking like a dusty traveler rather than a legendary general. When he and Lincoln finally met, there was an immediate, wordless understanding. Both were Westerners, both were men of few words, and both possessed a relentless, quiet stubbornness. Lincoln famously said of Grant, "I can't spare this man. He fights." The terrible summer of 1864, the summer that followed, was the bloodiest of the war. Grant launched the Overland Campaign, a series of brutal, non-stop battles in the Virginia woods. The casualty lists grew to staggering proportions: 50,000 men in just 1 month. In Washington, the air was thick with the smell of the massive military hospitals that had sprung up everywhere. Lincoln's melancholy deepened into something almost physical. He lost weight. His skin turned a sallow, earthy gray. He began to have recurring dreams of a phantom ship moving rapidly toward a dark, indefinite shore. In August, he was so certain he would lose the election to George McClellan, the general he had once fired, that he wrote a blind memorandum for his cabinet. He asked them to sign the back of the paper without reading it, pledging that if he lost, he would work with McClellan to save the Union before the new president took office in March. He was preparing for his own political death to ensure the nation's life. The tide turns. Atlanta in the 1864 election. Just as the lamp seemed to be flickering out, a lightning bolt struck from the south. In September, General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta. The news swept through the North like a prairie fire. It was the proof the people needed that the war was actually being won. The 1864 election was a miracle of democracy. No nation had ever held a full-scale election in the middle of a civil war. For the first time, soldiers were allowed to vote in the field. When the results came in, Lincoln had won a crushing victory. As he stood on the White House balcony to address a jubilant crowd, he didn't gloat. He looked at the sea of lanterns and said, "I am thankful to God for this approval of the people. But while deeply grateful for this mark of their confidence in me, if I know my heart, my gratitude is free from any taint of personal triumph. The second inaugural, with malice toward none, the winter of 1865 brought the final collapse of the Confederacy. On March 4, 1865, Lincoln stood for his second inauguration. The Iron Dome of the Capitol was finally finished, a solid, shining symbol of a Union preserved. As you lie there, imagine the sound of the rain hitting the mud of Pennsylvania Avenue just before he began to speak. Suddenly, the clouds parted, and a single brilliant beam of sunlight fell directly upon him. He didn't give a speech of victory. He gave a sermon of atonement. He suggested that the war was a woe sent by God to both North and South for the offense of slavery. He ended with words that are now carved into the very stone of his memorial. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. The evening peace of 1865. As the war drew to its final weeks, Lincoln traveled to the front lines at City Point, Virginia. He wanted to be near the men who had done the fighting. He sat by the campfires, swapped stories with the soldiers, and walked through the captured Confederate capital of Richmond, not as a conqueror, but as a man curiously looking at the city he had spent 4 years trying to save. As you settle into your blankets, imagine the quiet of the deck on the River Queen, the steamer that carried him back to Washington. The water of the Potomac is dark and smooth, reflecting the stars. Lincoln is sitting in a chair, reading Macbeth, specifically the passage about the death of Duncan. After life's fitful fever, he sleeps well. He is at peace. The fitful fever of the war is breaking. The Union is saved. The slaves are free. The national debt of his youth is paid, and the much larger debt of his presidency is finally being settled. The air in your room is still and cool. Like the city of Washington in the spring of 1865, the tension has finally dissolved into a soft, hopeful exhaustion. You have no overland campaigns to fight tomorrow. You have no political ghosts to appease. Your mind is a quiet ship moving toward its own peaceful shore. The better angels have finished their work for the day. Feel the heaviness of your limbs and the lightness of your spirit. The tall man has set down his book. The sunlight of the second inauguration is still warm in his memory, and he is finally closing his eyes to the sound of the river. Sleep now. The wounds are being bound. The story is finding its rest. The night is long and soft, and the world is safe in the quiet passage of time. April 1865 was a month of blossoms and bells. In Washington, the air was sweet with the scent of lilacs and the sound of cannons firing, not in anger, but in celebration. General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. The fitful fever of the war was finally over. Abraham Lincoln seemed transformed. The dark pools of sorrow in his eyes had cleared, replaced by a soft, luminous light. On the morning of April 14th, Good Friday, he sat at breakfast with his son Robert, who had just returned from the front. Later, he took a carriage ride with Mary. He told her, "We must both be more cheerful in the future. Between the war and the loss of our darling Willie, we have been very miserable." For the first time in 4 years, he spoke of a future of traveling to California, of returning to the law, of growing old in the quiet streets of Springfield. The last performance that evening, the President and Mary went to Ford's Theater to see a light comedy called Our American Cousin. It was meant to be a night of simple, well-earned laughter. As you lie there, imagine the interior of the theater, the velvet curtains, the soft glow of the gaslights, and the sound of the orchestra. Lincoln sat in a rocking chair in the presidential box, draped in his favorite shawl. At one point, he reached out and took Mary's hand. She whispered, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" Lincoln smiled and replied with his last recorded words, "She won't think anything about it." The tragedy that followed is a fixed point in history, a moment where the world seemed to stop its rotation. But as we drift toward sleep, we look not at the violence of the act, but at the peace that followed. Lincoln was carried across the street to a small boarding house, the Peterson House. Because he was so tall, they had to lay him diagonally across the bed. All through the night, as a soft rain fell on the city, his friends, his cabinet, and his family gathered in the dim light of a flickering candle. The rhythmic, heavy breathing of the president was the only sound in the room. At 7:22 the next morning, the breathing stopped. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, tears streaming down his face, broke the silence with a line that has echoed through the centuries. Now he belongs to the ages. The long journey home, the funeral train that carried Lincoln back to Springfield, was a mirror of the one that had brought him to Washington 4 years earlier. It retraced the route through the great cities of the North: Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Chicago. Millions of people stood in the rain, silent and weeping, as the black-draped engine passed by. But the real legacy was not in the mourning. It was in the transformation of the country. He had entered Washington as a minority president of a fractured republic. He left it as the savior of a unified nation and the great emancipator of 4 million people. He had proven that a government of the people could not only survive a civil war, but emerge from it with a more perfect conscience. The infinite rest. As you settle into the final moments of your journey tonight, imagine the quiet of Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield. The prairie wind is whispering through the oaks. The long, rhythmic clop-clop of the horses has faded forever. The national debt is paid. The house divided is standing tall. Abraham Lincoln is no longer walking the halls of the White House in his nightshirt. He is no longer studying maps by candlelight or waiting for the click-click of the telegraph. He has finally, as the poem he loved so much predicted, passed from life to his rest in the grave. But the rest is not a void. It is a presence. His voice is in the wind that ripples the Illinois wheat. His logic is in the laws that protect the weak. His heart is in the better angels that call us toward kindness. The air in your room is perfectly still. The heavy iron story of the 19th century is folding into the soft velvet pages of memory. You are safe. You are part of the new birth of freedom that he dreamed of. Your limbs are heavy, your mind is clear, and the candle of the day is flickering out. Like the phantom ship of Lincoln's dreams, you are moving toward a peaceful, quiet shore. The journey is complete. The work is finished. The tall man in the stovepipe hat has finally closed his eyes, and the world is at peace. Close your eyes now. Listen to the silence of the prairie night. Let the spirit of the woodsman, the lawyer, and the president guide you into the deep, restorative sleep of the ages. You are home. You are rested. You are at peace. After the funeral train came to its final stop in Springfield, a profound silence enveloped the nation. But for the American people, Lincoln had not truly departed. Stories of his life began to be told like sacred legends. People spoke of how he had seemingly foretold his own death through a dream, seeing a coffin resting in the center of the White House East Room and hearing the mournful sobs of invisible spirits. His passing on Good Friday transformed him into a symbol of ultimate sacrifice. In the hearts of many, he was no longer just a president, but an American Moses, the leader who guided his people through the wilderness of civil war, but was not permitted to set foot in the promised land of lasting peace himself. We must not forget the woman who stood by his side. Following Lincoln's death, Mary Todd's life became a prolonged tragedy. She lost her husband and 3 of her 4 sons. She faced harsh public scrutiny and an overwhelming mental burden. There is a deeply humanizing detail. In her final years, Mary often dressed in black and lived in darkened rooms. Clinging to the memories of her Abe, she kept her wedding ring, engraved with the words, "Love is eternal." Her story reminds us that behind every great figure are silent sacrifices and family sorrows that history sometimes overlooks in its haste. Lincoln does not belong to America alone. His influence reached across the world. From peasants in Russia to human rights activists in Asia, the name Lincoln became a beacon of freedom and the potential of the human spirit. In Russia, Tsar Alexander II closely followed Lincoln's struggle while implementing his own reforms to emancipate the serfs. In France, lovers of liberty contributed small coins to strike a gold medal for Mary Todd after his death, honoring the man who saved the Republic. He proved that a person born in poverty, without formal education, could reach the heights of wisdom and power through compassion and integrity. Why do we still speak of him in 2026? It is because his principles of leadership and human connection remain timeless. Magnanimity. He brought his greatest political rivals into his cabinet, the team of rivals. The power of language. He didn't use grandiloquent words. He used sincerity and parables to win hearts. Persistence. Midst a string of failures, he maintained an unshakable faith in the ultimate goal. Imagine standing before the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. at midnight. The soft yellow light illuminates the massive marble statue. Lincoln sits there, hands resting on the arms of his chair, eyes looking straight ahead. If you look closely at those hands, one is clenched in a fist, signifying determination and strength. The other is slightly relaxed, signifying mercy and reconciliation. This was the essence of the man, a perfect balance of steel and velvet. On the walls nearby, the words of the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural remain etched deep, reminding us that the work of binding up the nation as wounds is a task that never truly ends. Now, let your breath harmonize with the stillness of history. These 24 chapters of a life were not just milestones in time, but 24 movements of a grand symphony. From the boy reading by the fireplace in Indiana, to the lawyer traveling the muddy roads of Illinois, and finally to the father of the nation, he fulfilled his mission. He turned a house divided into a unified whole. The lights in your room are fading. The pages of Lincoln's life are closing. You no longer need to worry about battles or difficult decisions. Everything has been settled. His legacy is the freedom you possess and the peace you feel. Sleep well, sheltered by the noble values Lincoln left behind. Let your mind rest deeply, just as the vast Illinois sky embraces the cornfields into their slumber.